right, my AP language friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition, and I got another writing workshop video for you. So today we're going to chill out with Sotomayor and take a look at FRQ 2 from the 2022 exam. So we're going to spend some time figuring out how we can wield my heuristics to perform rhetorical analysis. So I'm going to stick to the status quo, and I'll paint the whole essay for you using my heuristics. So come time at the end of the video, you should have a pretty clear sense of how to tackle this essay from start to finish, because I'm going to show you a few times how to do the introduction paragraphs with my declarative thesis heuristic. I'll show you how to do the body paragraphs with the syllogistic method heuristic, and then I got some sentence stems so that you can tag a conclusion paragraph onto this. So let us take a look at the prompt and see what the good old College Board is tasking us to do for this rhetorical analysis. So it reads as follows. Born in New York City to Puerto Rican parents, Sonia Sotomayor was appointed a United States Supreme Court Justice in 2009, becoming the first Latina justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. She delivered the speech, A Latina Judge's Voice, at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law in 2001, when she was an appeals court judge. The following passage is an excerpt from the speech. Read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Sotomayor makes to convey her message about her identity. So we know from the prompt already when they say her identity that one of the main rhetorical devices that we're going to have to focus on is ethos, right? She's probably going to spend quite a bit of time constructing her ethos in this speech. So you got to learn how to read prompts and get a sense of like what your thesis is probably most likely going to be from the prompt. And oftentimes the prompt like shows its hands like in a poker match. And we know that this is going to be very heavy on the ethos just from reading and unpacking the prompt. So let's see if that holds true. Let's see what's in my writing samples and see if that is an accurate statement or not. So we got a whole bunch of blank canvas. In fact, we haven't even started. So let's ask ourselves the question. So how do I write the introductory paragraph? Before I do that, I always say this to students and teachers. You gotta Bob Ross your instruction. So what I mean by that is this. Bob Ross used heuristics, and we are going to use heuristics in this essay. His heuristic was called the wet on wet technique. So every single time he approached a natural landscape, he just did the exact same uniform thing. And for us, we're doing expository writing. So on the Lang exam, we got synthesis, we got argument, we got persuasion, right? And you can even do it for research, literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, you name it. We're going to take the same uniform approach every single time. We know that we can declare the thesis, invert the thesis, and bust out the body paragraph syllogistically. So over time, as you see my videos, you're like, holy cow, Kristian's doing the exact same thing. Yes, that's what I mean by Bob Rossing the instruction. We're going to demystify the whole process for you so that you intuitively, instinctually know what to do. Sans teacher, right? I don't want you to sit there at a blank screen, a blank sheet of paper, guessing what does teacher want? What does College Board want, right? Because that's not going to probably yield some good writing. So we're going to take all the guesswork out. But here's the thing. I'm going to break security clearance and tell you something top secret. And here it is, my friends. The College Board will arrest me for telling you this. But in all of those rhetorical analysis prompts, implicit in the language of the prompt are two questions. And if you answer these questions, you are guaranteeing yourself the thesis point. And then if you can do it with some pizzazz and some spunkiness and some flair, you're positioning yourself for the sophistication point. So here's the truth. Inside that prompt are two questions. The first is, how does the author construct meaning? The second is, what is the authorial intent? And my students, when they write introductions for rhetorical analysis, exclusively go with the declarative model. And if you're familiar with my work, you know that my students always take 4 sentences to house their introductory paragraph. Here's the math for this. We're going to take 3 sentences and answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? So 3 sentences, how does the author construct meaning? When you get into the construction of meaning, you've got to use your terms, devices, techniques. Since it's 3 sentences, I often ask my students to find the 3 most salient, relevant, germane, pertinent terms, devices, technique that constitute like the pith and substance of the speech and drop those in the thesis. So whenever you answer that question, how does the author construct meaning, that constitutes the thesis. Authorial intent gets to exigence, universal truth, universal theme, however your teachers express that concept, and that usually just takes a sentence. So what I do when I read is I go terms and device technique hunting. So I know that I have to get all those terms, devices, techniques into my thesis statement, and they have to go into my first premise, right? Because we're performing rhetorical analysis. We're not doing plot analysis. We don't want to do a recitation of what Sotomayor stated in the speech. And that's kind of the faux pas, the snafu, the pitfall that students fall into with this particular FRQ is that it reads like a Cliff Note summation, and it can't. So go get your terms, devices, techniques through the reading process, and if you can ascertain the meaning of the text and then wield my heuristics, you're going to be pretty groovy at the end of the essay. So let's break down what the declarative thesis looks like visually. So as I already alluded to, we know we're going to begin with the thesis. We're going to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? And that question is going to house the first 3 sentences. All right, we're going to drop 3 terms in there. You got to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background, and that usually comes in the guise of the authorial intent sentence. And then we know we're writing an academic paper. The College Board's our audience. So we're going to need a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. I run intensive word study academies with my students. So over the course of the academic year, they augment their vocabulary pretty exponentially if they give me an iota of effort. So come exam times, they're pretty fancy Nancy with their diction. Sentence constructs is something else that I explicitly teach. I want my students to be syntactical ninjas. So we spend a lot of time in Strunk & White's book called Write It Right. And they have something called rule number 18, in which they espouse the idea that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a sentence. I want my students to break a pattern that struggling and emerging like young writers do by default. So they just commit themselves to independent clause, independent clause, independent clause, short, simple declarative sentences over and over and over again, so that it creates a da-dot, 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 da-dot kind of rhythm and flow. So to get real musical with your voice, rhythm, and flow, you have to be able to manipulate those 12 sentence types, but there's also something known as the sentence patterns. There's 20 patterns. So my students know when to wield certain sentence types for effect and purpose. So I'll model that in my writing today for you so that you get a sense of that. And then I've already stated this, it's going to be exactly 4 sentences long. So let's recap before we see exemplar 1. 3 plus 1, 3 construction of meaning, 1 authorial intent. Here's exemplar number 1. I'll read it top to bottom and then I'll unpack it for you and tell you all the minutia that goes into it. An amalgamation of so many different backgrounds and contexts, Sotomayor principally defines her identity through anecdote and enumeration. Giving voice to what it is to exactly be a New York Rican proves challenging, but the appeals court judge details the various tensions and collisions that comprise the chemistry of her true character. Anchoring her speech in a time-old rhetorical question, who am I? She employs an inviting and casual tone to bridge the fact that she's a minority making strides. Knowing that America's identity is ambivalently understood, Sotomayor makes it clear that her ethnicity and identity are one in the same. So let's break this down. Let's focus on the terms, the devices, techniques. I always encourage my students to do a nice teeter-totter balance of explicit, implicit. You don't have to be explicit in dropping your terms, devices, techniques. I always tell my students that, sometimes AP readers get fatigued, they get tired, and some of them have this notion that if the thesis does not have an explicit statement of the terms, devices, techniques, hence it's not a thesis statement. So I say at least drop one or two of the terms just so that you get rewarded the thesis point. So you have things in here like enumeration and anecdote. That's what I mean by being explicit. But in terms of the ethos, I never say ethos, but within this thesis statement here, you can see that I'm really focused on the ethos as well. And then I never said syntax, but you know that one of the things I'm espousing in this is the idea that her syntactical manipulations are very, very important. And I also got to the tone, which I explicitly stated. So you can see there it's a teeter-totter balance. You don't need to be, so forthright and just blunt and say it matter of factly. You can kind of hint around things and nevertheless get yourself the thesis point. My diction is up. I have plenty of tier 2 level words in there. I like words like amalgamation, anecdote, enumeration, tensions, collisions, right? Anchoring. So good words like that bode well in terms of being in contention for the sophistication point. And then one thing I tell my students is this: don't parallel your sentences unless you have absolute reason to, and typically you don't in an introductory paragraph. So pay attention to the sentence that you just dropped, eyeball it and say, what kind of sentence type is that? And then don't parallel it in the next sentence, because if you do, that's how you get that droning rhythm, right? You sound robotic when you write that way. So pay attention to the sentence constructs, make sure they're all very supple flowing, and you'll get something that looks closely akin to what I just did. This is hard. It's complicated. It takes a lot of practice. So don't intellectually shut down. Let's do it again before you quit on me. So it's really something that with practice becomes really readily accessible and sort of intuitive with time. So exemplar number 2, I'll read it and unpack it. I'm going to go 3+1, declarative, thesis, heuristic. Given that America is deeply confused about its own identity, Sotomayor carefully crafts her ethos to announce that even though she comes from a diverse background, she herself is not mistaken as to who she is as a U.S. citizen, or for that matter, an appeals court judge. The thrust of her speech is rooted in a simple but profound rhetorical question. Who are any of us within the context of the vast differences and similarities in this country? Enumerating her story through anecdote, Sotomayor takes a rather casual and informal approach to express the ambivalence of being a New York Rican. Her speech, like her identity, blends all the facets of her ethnic makeup. So you can see here again, I'm going to run through this quickly. I have a teeter-totter balance of explicit, implicit. So I said ethos in this one just to really hammer it home, but I did the same thing. I think the enumeration and anecdote is really important. I think leading with the rhetorical question is a very interesting syntactical gesture. And then, I like this last sentence here because it's kind of the authorial intent. Her speech, like her identity, blends all the facets of her ethnic makeup. It's a hodgepodge of a whole bunch of rhetorical devices, techniques that she's wielding together in order to construct the meaning. And it's quite a fascinating, complicated speech. But you can unpack it with a little bit of practice and some guidance from your teacher. So it ain't so bad. Yes, you can, kids. Don't sit there and say you can't. You can do this. I'll model it for you one more time. And I'm going to simplify this one and pump the brakes just a tad bit in case it's going over your head. Knowing that she's not the typical appeals court judge and that she's neither white nor male, Sotomayor carefully constructs her ethos to announce her presence in the field of law. So I got ethos, right? primarily through anecdote. So that's number 2. She details the complexity of her mixed New York Rican origins and upbringing. Enumerating. That's number 3. Her familial and ethnic ties. She embraces a casual, at times informal tone. So I got tone in there as well because this is a really juicy piece. There's a lot in there. While America is a bit confused about its own identity, Sotomayor isn't, as she confidently responds to her own rhetorical questions. And that is the exigence in that last sentence, the authorial intent, universal truth, universal theme, however you want to express that concept. So intros are done. Good place to pause. Students, write with each other. Show each other your work. Teachers, if you're viewing this, maybe you want to draft a couple and show them to your students to further demystify. Still plenty of blank canvas left in front of us. Next question becomes, so how do I write the body paragraphs? And ka-ching, I've already alluded to this, we're going syllogistic method from start to finish for these bodies. So the syllogistic method is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition, comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And I don't know what your philosophical backgrounds are in terms of studying it, but one of the seminal texts is Plato's Republic. And in it, they throw out this essential question: what is justice? And in composition, we deal with essential questions all the time. So the philosophical think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle, like us composition instructors, is principally concerned in the art of argumentation with something known as line of reasoning, which I'm sure you've heard. And he was like, why do some kids have like perfectly intact lines of reasoning? He called it cogency. And one day he had a eureka moment. He said, I got it. There's like a mathematical, computative, calculative formula that students are using to package their thinking. And he called it the syllogistic method. In simple terms, all that means is that you're going from premise to conclusion. I'll give you an example. If I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you all would say, yep, Kristian, you are absolutely correct. If I follow it up with premise 2 and state, my dog ate arsenic, logically, deductively, you're all going to conclude, uh-oh, Kristian, that ain't boding so well for your dog. Your dog's going to die. And we would call that a cogent argument. We would call that a tight line of reasoning. So how do we morph that heuristic and turn it into a heuristic for the purposes of performing rhetorical analysis? Here's the kicker, my friend. First premise is going to be an argument containing the terms, the devices, the techniques. So you got to use that whole bevy at your disposal there and go 3 sentences. I like to say this for all expository writing. The College Board says it for the synthesis essay, FRQ 1, but I say it for all expository writing. Your argument must be central. If you begin to paraphrase or quote in sentences 1, 2, or 3, you're probably going to lose the centrality of your argument and commit the faux pas of writing plot analysis, plot summation, instead of rhetorical analysis. So I don't want to see any quotes or paraphrases until the 4th sentence. Keep that argument central. By taking 3 sentences, you can multitask so that you're not writing 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph ethos, 1 paragraph pathos, etc. Right? Because that's too plotting and dutiful. It's just not sophisticated at all at this level. So I'll show you how to multitask a first premise. 4th sentence begins the 2nd premise. This takes the shape of textual support. You want to teeter-totter balance your quoting and paraphrasing. You don't want to do one so much more at the expense of the other. And I'll demonstrate for you my 5-word rule that helps us embed quotes silky smooth. And then conclusions are necessary for body paragraphs. Oftentimes students just run like heck. They abandon their thought and jump to the next body paragraph, and readers are like, hey, wait a minute, man, you gotta conclude the thought there. I can't put the bow on the present. You gotta do that. So textual analysis comes in the conclusion, and it's your link back to the prompt, your echo back to the thesis, and then you upholding the promise of the first premise. Students often ask, Mr. Kuhn, how many sentences is this going to take? Because this seems like a lot. And I was like, you're right. You need a lot of support and analysis. So it's going to take 10 to 12 sentences. That's usually the typical length for body paragraphs that use the syllogistic method heuristic. So you might be asking yourselves, what does a first premise look like? I'll show you. So students ask good questions, and I like that because it's indicative of the fact that you're learning and want to learn. Students often ask, Mr. Kuhn, where do I begin my analysis in the body paragraphs? And I say, start where the author starts. Like literally begin where Sotomayor begins her speech and methodically work your way through it in like a chronological order and cross weave when necessary. So I'm not a big fan of sentence stems. I'm not a big fan of templates and front loading all your verbiage for you. I think that really stifles you, and it's just a training wheel or a scaffold that you don't need. You guys are smart cookies. You don't need all that stuff. But for your first time, your first whack at it, if you want to really make sure that you're keeping your line of reasoning intact, try the following stem. It's just 4 words and a comma right from the onset. It cues your reader into knowing that you have like a methodological approach, a calculative approach to your analysis, and that you're going to be supremely organized. So I like that stem, and it's not over front loading you guys things in terms of answering the prompt and doing the writing for you. So look where I go here. I got to drop some terms, devices, techniques. I mentioned the idea of multitasking. Look how I use multiple terms, devices, and techniques. Right from the onset, Sotomayor addresses the elephant in the room. Who is this non-white, non-male Latina judge? So that I'm implying ethos there, right? In a country as racially ambivalent as the US, she carefully sets course to establish her ethos by delineating her narrative, highlighting the multifaceted influences that help comprise her identity. She engages her audience in her story, right? So I got ethos, and I'm also implying the fact that she can, use the enumerated approach and anecdote. So what do I need to do here, right, in terms of the first premise? Simple. Let's recap this. 3 sentences house the argument, the rhetorical argument. What I do in the process of my writing is I put that first premise into the promise of the first premise into a promise. I promised you an analysis of ethos, enumeration, and what was the other one? Enumeration and anecdote. So I got to go quote and paraphrase hunting. So I need quotes and or paraphrases for all 3 of those things. In order to have a line of reasoning, I have to keep the promise of the first premise. I must have quotes and or paraphrases for those 3 things. Otherwise, I have something called an enthymeme. It's a breaking of the reasoning. I'm not proceeding premise, conclusion, or I'm leaving parts out or bringing in other parts. So because I said those 3 things, I don't want to like bring in something extraneous, like all of a sudden talk about extended metaphor or something, because I didn't promise you that. It's not what I set you up to read. So I got to stay very cogent in there. So let's see the transition into the second premise. And look how I do this. So since I started with ethos, that's where I need to start with my 4th sentence, the beginning of the second premise. And I tell my students, go quote hunting, right? Get into the quotes, either paraphrase or quote right in that 4th sentence. Get our noses into the text. So immediately, she herself draws her ethos to the forefront of the discussion by beginning her speech with the rhetorical question, who am I? So I'm also getting syntax out of the way in talking about the rhetorical question. Rhetorically, this is an interesting and bold move. Much later in the speech, she explains that America has a deeply confused image of itself that is in perpetual tension. While she confidently brands herself as being a New York-Rican, America is quibbling as to whether or not it is a melting pot or a salad bowl. So let's talk about how I'm embedding my quotes, because those sound pretty silky smooth. You don't hear any like abrupt, brusque transitions. I use something called the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum, so not exactly, but a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. As you'll see, just eyeballing this second premise, I do use brackets a few times. So get into the habit of using brackets to make things conversational. And I'll model that in just a second here. So when we quote, we know we got to analyze. For Sotomayor, however, she is confident in asserting that her Latina soul was forged and closely nurtured by her family through their shared experiences and traditions. Even though there are stark differences across all cultures, she states that things like mucho platos de arroz grandules e perel are at the forefront of the forces that helped forge her identity. In creating this dichotomy, Sotomayor is ultimately saying this: she belongs. Even though she was raised on Orejos de Cuchafrito, she has earned her place as an appeals court judge. I don't speak Spanish and I slaughtered that, and I so apologize. So I learned French in high school and college, so forgive me on that. One of the things my students overlooked in this particular passage, and it's like they felt kind of weird talking about it, was the statement of the obvious. There's so much Spanish in this speech. You have to focus on that, right? That she uses quite a bit of English and Spanish intermixed and melds them together. So the diction is very important because she's an amalgamation of these cultures, these identities. So is her diction, right? So you can see there that all my quotes and paraphrases are attached, they're linked, they're germane to what I promised in the first premise. But we just can't end on a quote, right? We got to conclude the thought and cross the finish line. Let's go back to the prompt. Let's go back to the thesis and come full circle on this. The conclusion of a syllogism usually takes 1 or 2 sentences. Even though America might be experiencing some identity confusion, Sotomayor is not. She's a Puerto Ricana who loves her country and will serve it proudly. And that is it, right? That's how you stay cogent. That's how you have a line of reasoning. That's how you quote. And that's a whole syllogistic body paragraph right there for you. And that is how you would rock and roll that first body paragraph. So, again, if you're writing with me, pause, try your hand at that first premise. 3 sentences, drop the terms, devices, techniques. Second premise begins 4th sentence, quote, paraphrase, teeter-totter, balance that. Make sure you throw a conclusion on it as well. Keep the promise of the first premise. So we got intro, first body done. What do I do next? We have to ask ourselves. And this might shock you, and you might say, oh my gosh, it's that easy. Here's what you do. You bust out another syllogism. So we know that the essay is going to be 4 paragraphs long. So all FRQs, Lang and Lit, 4 paragraphs is what my students write. Intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. So at this stage of the game, I'm a little above the middle of the speech. So I still got a whole bunch of stuff that I have to analyze. I still could go further with the enumeration, the anecdote. There's other syntactical features in here that I have to get at as well. So it's going to be very easy for me to, front load that first premise with a few things so that I multitask. I'm going to, cherry pick my quotes and paraphrases from the middle all the way to the end of the speech. I'm done with the beginning, top third of it. So I don't want to take any quotes, paraphrases from there. And then I'll wrap it all up at the end, 10 to 12 sentences. So I'm going to have you guys try that on your own so that you're not stealing my thunder and doing too much mimicry of me, because that's not learning. So you guys got to do some heavy lifting on your own. So give it a whirl. Then let's talk about wrapping up this essay. We need a conclusion paragraph for this. And one of the things that I do early in the academic year are sentence stems. Again, I'm fine with training wheels and scaffolds, but I don't want them to be permanent fixtures. So keep in mind, a conclusion is sort of more or less like a grand finale of a fireworks display. You're like hammering exigence at the end. Big universal truth, big universal theme, right? Huge authorial intent. So stems that say something like this, all encapsulating. Simply said, uh, things like evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, and at the end of the day. So one of the things that I'll show you real quick, because I have a video for this in the YouTube channel, because I'm doing videos from 2015 all the way to the present moment. So FRQ 1, 2, and 3, Lang and Lit. Let's take a look at the next year's rhetorical analysis, which was the Rita Dove commencement speech. Just because I don't want you to mimic me too much. Look what I do for the Rita Dove passage, and then you can do one for the Sotomayor on your own. Just give you a sense of how to do it using a different text. When one boils down all the possible pearls of wisdom one could bestow upon a graduating class, Dove's wish list offers a unique twist. If the soul stays hungry, prepares without relent, and embraces the rocky times, life can be a very special journey. Having lived by the rules of these wishes, Dove is a perfect case in point to verify the truth of her statement. So usually my conclusions take 3 or 4 sentences. Quick wrap up, quick summation of everything that you talked about, and you're good to go. And you can drop the mic and be confident that you've written a good rhetorical analysis. Of course, you got to read the passage well, though. So the reading and the writing go hand in hand. All right, I'm peacing out, signing off. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you want to reach me for anything, drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I answer everyone's email, so don't ever hesitate to reach out. I devote like an hour a day to just to responding to emails, so it's something that I like to do. So I also am a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. I present for NCTE quite a bit. Might even be doing some presentations this summer in Vegas with the College Board. And I present with Perfection Learning as well from time to time. So I have a calendar of events on teachinghowtowrite.com, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. And you can see some of my professional development offerings. Some are free, some are for a nominal fee, and we run those through National Writing Project principally. Also, students, note that I have a tutoring company that I call Write at Ivy Writes. So I'm an Ivy League graduate. I've done my degrees at Ivy League institutions, and I have an excellent sense of what you guys need to do for your college personal statements and your supplements as well. So I'm very well versed in that. So if you want some coaching as you apply to college, hook me up. Give me an email, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. And also in my tutoring business, I help students crush the AP exams. I've been teaching these for over 2 decades, so I'm pretty well versed in it. So drop me an email and we can talk specifics about getting you in my tutoring books, and we can begin the process right away. All right, that's it. I'm signing off. That is the end, and I'll see you next time.